Hello, and thank you for joining us today for this primer on the Arizona Long-Term Care System, or ALTCS. In this presentation, we'll walk through the history of county involvement in the program, explain the mechanisms of the funding formula, and discuss the fiscal volatility that our counties have faced in recent years. To get us started, we first need to define exactly what the system is and, more importantly, what specific populations the counties are responsible for supporting. ALTCS is the state's long-term care program administered by ALTCS, and it provides essential medical and nursing services to the indigent, elderly, and physically disabled population in Arizona. While the federal and state agencies exclusively fund the developmentally disabled population, or DDD, counties are statutorily required to cover a portion of the non-federal state match for the EPD population. So while ALTCS now manages this on a statewide level, it's helpful to understand that this wasn't always the case. The program's roots are actually found at a time when long-term care was exclusively a county responsibility. Prior to 1989, providing long-term care was exclusively a county cost, with local jurisdictions running their own county hospitals or nursing homes. And because there was no federal or state participation at the time, counties maintained full control over all the toggles, including eligibility, benefits, and program costs, which led to varying levels of services across the state. The state of Arizona was actually one of the last in the country to say, hey, we probably need some federal dollars to support this program. Medicaid had existed since the 1960s, and most other states had already started to participate. But in order to do that here, we couldn't have a fragmented county-by-county approach. So ALTCS as an agency was created in the early 1980s, and a few years after that, the long-term care system was created. This allowed us to serve this population on a statewide basis and to pull down federal funds to do so. However, counties were still fully required to fund the state's portion of the program costs. That original formula was based on fixed percentages from a 1988 Auditor General audit of local spending, meaning that counties were responsible for these payments regardless of whether or not their local spending had actually increased or decreased. But by the mid-1990s, these costs had more than doubled, becoming financially unsustainable under the constitutional revenue and spending limits established in the 1980s. This led the state and the counties to work together in 1997 to reform the funding system that still defines the landscape that we operate in today. That was done by fundamentally overhauling the funding structure and established a 50-50 growth split where the state and counties would share in the future program growth equally. It also moved the system away from those old audit percentages to a model where payments are distributed based on the current program utilization, and it added a number of statutory circuit breakers to protect local finances. But an increasing population and healthcare costs continued to drive county contributions in an unsustainable way. So in 2007, the counties and the state again worked together to adopt an additional circuit breaker to provide relief, which was based on a per capita mechanism. But following that 1997 redesign and the addition of the per capita circuit breaker in 2007, the Great Recession hit the state. During this period, Arizona faced a multi-billion-dollar funding shortfall, which led the legislature to enact cost containment measures, including reductions in provider rate reimbursements, capitation rate caps, and the elimination of certain benefits like adult dental care. Additionally, as a part of the federal stimulus package, the federal government increased its share of Medicaid funding, which effectively subsidized the state and county match. The result? A nearly 10-year period of stagnant or even declining costs for the state and the counties. But over the last decade, we've entered a period of rapid expansion, which much more closely reflects the rapid increases that we saw in the mid-1990s. This shift was driven by the legislature's decision to increase provider rates and respond to rising healthcare costs, including those associated with Prop 206, the minimum wage law, and a tight labor market. More recently, the COVID-19 pandemic has created a V-shaped fiscal trend, with temporary increases in federal support that lowered state and county costs. But as that federal aid returned to normal, the local costs sprang back up quickly, resulting in sharp year-over-year adjustments. Additionally, as the state gets wealthier relative to the rest of the country, the federal match rate for these programs is declining, which is putting additional upward pressure on the state match. Looking into fiscal 2027, the state and the counties are projected to contribute roughly $450 million each. However, unlike the state, counties have seen a lot more individual volatility in their contributions over the last 5 years. So to better understand that, let's dig into the details of the county model. This model is fairly complex, so let's break it down into its component parts. Each year, the state does a calculation where they say, what was our cost last year and what's it going to be in the next year, and what's the difference? We then take that growth, divide it in half, and the state pays for one half, while the starting point for the counties is the other half plus last year's contribution. Then each county's payment is determined by its proportionate share of utilization, which just refers to the actual non-federal spending in a particular county 2 fiscal years prior. So for example, if 1% of the ALTCS spending occurred in Graham County, that county would be responsible for 1% of the total county contribution requirement. But the formula doesn't just end there. It also includes statutory relief mechanisms, which we refer to as circuit breakers. So there's 3 of those that provide relief now. First, a county's contribution is capped at a 90-cent property tax rate. Second, counties with a Native American population over 20% receive an alternative formula adjustment to reflect their unique tax base. And finally, there is a per capita cap, which ensures that no county pays more than the statewide average per person. If a county would exceed any of these thresholds, the state general fund kicks in the rest. So you can see in the chart on the right, the amount of relief provided varies pretty widely by county. So this chart shows the circuit breaker amounts in orange compared to the county's enacted contribution in blue. So for example, in Apache County, without these first 2 circuit breakers, the county's contribution would be in excess of $9 million. That amounts to over half of that county's general fund, which is why these circuit breakers exist. That county's tax base could not handle the contribution level if it was just based on utilization. So while these circuit breakers provide essential relief, they don't change the underlying forces, for example, the cost of care, which determine the total program cost in the first place. So to understand how these different components in the county model work, let's look at a few trend examples. All of these charts will show a number of different metrics mapped to their level in 2020 for comparison. So for example, this chart demonstrates how the total contribution required of counties has increased faster than the total cost of the program, about 48% over this period, but that the state's contribution has increased even more quickly at about 90%. However, the county model means that individual county contributions can be substantially different from the aggregate trend. Here we've got Graham County as an example, and you can see that their annual trend is pretty different from the aggregate. So let's break down why. As you can see by this dotted blue line, statewide enrollment has remained stagnant after declining post-pandemic. In fact, there are actually fewer people in the system today than there were in 2020. However, Graham County's individual trend is different from the statewide total. While they saw a long-term decline in membership, they see a sudden bump here in enrollment. And remember, utilization has 2 primary drivers, the number of people and their cost of care. So let's see how total utilization was changed by this trend. We can see the result here, with their utilization increasing a lot more rapidly than we would have expected from that small bump in enrollment. But the trend line here is important. So you can see how Graham's increase in utilization is much steeper than the statewide trend in the same time period. That meant that their share of the total bill increased over that same time period. And so when a single county's utilization performs differently than the statewide trend, it means that that county's contribution is going to have a more dramatic version of, or potentially the opposite of, the statewide trend. We can see the final result of that utilization shift here, a dramatic and sudden increase in the actual check the county had to pay. So although Graham was subject to one of those circuit breakers I mentioned before, this surge in utilization caused them to have a 45% increase in their ALTCS bill in a single year. To put the sheer magnitude of that kind of volatility into perspective, that level of increase for Graham County is the fiscal equivalent of the state general fund having to contribute $580 million more in a single year. That kind of change would be a huge impediment to the state balancing its budget, and Graham County had similar difficulties. So now that we've seen the mechanics in action through the Graham County case study, let's look at the broader picture across the state. This slide displays the trends for each of our 15 counties, with every line indexed to its level in 2018. As you can see, the experience is anything but uniform. While larger jurisdictions trend more with the total cost of the program, and as a result have seen significant cost pressure in recent years, several of the rural counties have faced a lot of volatility. If you look specifically at the charts for Apache, Coconino, and Navajo, you can see that the volatility is significant, with trend lines that swing substantially year over year. There was a small misalignment in how the county model was applied for that on-reservation circuit breaker we talked about, which was causing that volatility, and it should be corrected moving forward. However, other counties such as Cochise, La Paz, and Graham have seen their volatility driven by those utilization changes we discussed earlier. And because the formula can be very sensitive to member acuity and enrollment swings, a county can see a massive cost adjustment even when the state trend remains flat. In closing, it's important to remember that while counties were once providers of long-term care, today they're exclusively payers in the system and don't really have an administrative or decision-making role. And with limited financial flexibility to generate revenues to pay for state mandates, rapid or erratic increases in contribution requirements can create strain on local budgets. If you're interested in learning more, you can check out our website at countysupervisors.org. Thank you for watching.